So very warm welcome in the first session, which is an open session, and to that session we have present with us, in addition to members from FSA and also from FSS, we also have with us representatives from three stakeholders, Carol McLaren from QMS, Angus Lowndes from the Association of Meat Inspectors, and Martin Morgan from Scottish Association of Meat Wholesalers. And with that, I hand over with great pleasure to Heather Hancock, Chair of FSA, who is chairing the first session.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you for welcoming us here today. As you know, this is the first time that the Boards of Food Standards Scotland and the FSA have met together, and this session constitutes a formal meeting of each of those boards. It is being recorded so that a full record of the meeting will be available in future. We would normally in FSA live stream our meetings, but we've adjusted our process in this case just for the sheer administrative practicalities and to fit in with FSS's normal way of doing business. So I think that's a good solution. We have an apology from Stuart Reid, one of the FSA board members, who is at the Palace being invested with his CBE today. So I did think that was an okay excuse. Ross, I don't know whether you've got any apologies from your board members.
Yes, we have two apologies, don't we? We have two apologies. We have Carrie Ruxton and Louise Welsh.
Thank you very much. So the purpose of this joint meeting is to discuss the Cutting Plant and Cold Store review. I'm delighted to introduce Colin Sullivan and Ian McWatt, who are the SROs for this review, and Simon Dawson of the Food Standards Agency, who was the review lead. And I think I'm going to hand over to Colin to introduce the paper. Oh, he's there. I couldn't see you, Colin, at the end of the table.
Thank you, Heather. Good morning, everyone. Members of the two boards will recall that around 6 months ago, the two chairs commissioned this report with a clear ambition of improving consumer confidence in the meat processing industry in the wake of a limited number, but nonetheless high-profile incidents in relation to non-compliance issues, which have had the impact of casting a shadow not only on those businesses directly involved, but more widely across the industry as a whole. And hence we've embarked upon this evidence-based review that you have in front of you. And our review has taken a fundamental look at how the current arrangements could work better and focus on tackling the root causes of issues needing improvement. It has been a genuine joint effort. It's involved joint governance and work streams working together with colleagues from FSS and FSA working together under a unified program structure, with a joint project board chaired by our two chief executives. We've also availed of an external challenge group, a new departure for us in terms of a new approach to the methodology of undertaking reviews of this nature. Challenging, yes, but I think positively challenging, and we believe that that has helped to refine the product that you have in front of you. Of course, it's important at the outset to highlight that the majority of firms in the meat sector act responsibly, ensuring that food safety is important to them, and it's the actions of some that have damaged the reputation of the industry. And that's another reason for embarking on this review, and we were very pleased that as a result of that issue and that concern across the industry in terms of the reputation as a whole, that industry engaged and participated widely in the design work and in the development of the recommendations. Indeed, we've put quite a lot of time into stakeholder engagement and evidence gathering, although it has been during the summer, which was a difficult time to do that. But it's important to highlight that we contacted all of the 419 local authorities across the UK. We contacted over 300 food businesses in the meat sector to seek their views. There were 6 user design workshops, and those covered all 4 countries of the UK, and involved almost 100 organisations, whether they be meat sector businesses, local authorities and trade bodies. And we've also engaged with more than 60 industry stakeholder organisations. And when it comes to implementing the recommendations that the board accept, we hope to continue to work with industry, the local authorities and other stakeholders in delivering these identified changes, which we don't believe carry significant cost considerations nor indeed increase the regulatory burden significantly or to a degree of note. So I'll now hand over to Ian, my colleague and fellow SRO, who will take us through the recommendations.
Thank you, Colin. Chair, board members, you will have noted that the recommendations we have made are brigaded under a number of key themes that we consider address the main areas of concern. These recommendations are wide-reaching and intend to secure improvements not only to future working practices, food hygiene and food standards within cutting plants and cold stores, but also with regard to how the industry uses and shares information with each other and, importantly, with regulators. The recommendations further consider competencies and training requirements for the industry and for regulators, and also seek to develop improvements to official controls and how they are delivered, and of course to associated guidance. The incidents that gave rise to this review highlighted worrying behaviours and attitudes within some parts of industry, and we believe the move to greater industry transparency with respect to data sharing, wider deployment and sharing of CCTV footage, coupled with improved competency matrices and guidance, will make significant improvements in this regard. However, this is a complex matter and there is much to do, and will take significant effort from all, including regulators and industry, to make this happen, and we're committed to work with industry partners going forward to address this. Given the ambitious timelines from project launch, it is important to note that detailed implementation plans did not form part of our activity to date. That will come next, and work in this regard is clearly predicated in the board's discussions and decisions here today. I would also ask board members to note that we have avoided detailed discussion on the use of third-party private assurance within this report, as existing programmes within Food Standards Scotland and FSA are already considering this. Board members, however, can be assured that this will be a key strand of the work to improve information sharing and industry transparency going forward. Successful delivery of these recommendations will be challenging, and assuming board's agreement, the executives will each seek to develop implementation plans under the regulatory strategy and regulating our future programmes. As members will have noted from footnotes 4 and 5 in the board paper, these plans will be slightly different. However, FSS and FSA will continue to work closely in their development, and where it's appropriate to do so, will work jointly to develop a common UK approach. As part of our implementation planning, we will work with other regulators and with industry to ascertain what works well currently, and to ensure we prioritise our activities in such a way to deliver quick wins where they exist, and to ensure we secure the necessary improvements as quickly as we can. I'd like to conclude, Chair, by thanking all in the project team, the challenge group, and in particular Simon and Sandy McDougall. I'd like to thank the industry for their hard work in pulling together a huge amount of information and providing you with such a comprehensive report in what was a short timescale. There's been excellent collaboration between both executives during this time and will continue to do so during the implementation work that follows. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I thought we might just start going around the table and checking, is there any points of clarification on the report that anybody wants before we talk about the actual recommendations and conclusions? Marvellous. Oh, Colm.
Just one, Chair, and it's actually in relation to recommendation 1 and the absence of a tick for Northern Ireland in relation to that. Now, I appreciate that's probably because it's a DARE responsibility in Northern Ireland, but how do we make sure that they follow the recommendations within the report as well?
Colin, do you want to come in on that?
I think that reflects the fact that we are dealing with DARE in Northern Ireland, but Northern Ireland has been very involved in this, and we will be involved in the implementation, and we will involve DARE in those conversations.
Ruth.
I think this falls into clarification. You talk about having a Cabinet Office review of the project at the end of the implementation period. I just want to be clear that that would include all the actions recommended for industry as well as the two agencies. The way it's written, it sort of lends me to think it might be just following up the role of the agencies in implementing the project, but I wanted to be sure that we actually had oversight of all of the recommendations through that process.
Yes, I mean, our post-project evaluation will look at all of the recommendations and comment on how well they've been implemented and how well the project's gone across the board.
The whole piece. Thank you.
Marika.
Yeah, in that case, I also have a question for clarification, which is in relation to recommendation 8. And this might just be my ignorance of the exact arrangements, but I would like to understand why this particular recommendation doesn't appear to apply to Scotland. This is about
the major incident plan alignment.
No, it's the recommend. If we look at the list at the end of the report, it's the to test the value in mapping the BRC directory open information to the agency's data on establishments.
Ian, Jeff, do one of you want to pick that up?
That's actually an error. I think.
Oh, that's an error. Yes.
Well done.
I didn't understand.
It would apply to us equally. It's
Right,
it's
okay.
a UK.
Okay, so that's just
in the box is accurate.
that's an oversight. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, Sue. Sorry, can't quite see it.
Again, clarification. We've got some longer term recommendations beyond 18 months. That's somewhat open-ended. When are we expecting full implementation? Do we have a view on that, or do we have to wait till we have the implementation plan worked through to know how long it will take?
Yeah, I mean, I think this review was ambitious to do it in 6 months. We made that clear whenever we briefed both boards in May and June, that there would be some things that we would need further work on, and into those issues that go beyond 18 months, we can't give definitive timelines around. We're committed to undertaking them, subject to the board's endorsing our recommendations. But obviously, we'll need to work through the implementation plans to be able to give you the details subsequently.
So will we be expecting those implementation plans to come back to the respective boards or their business committees, whatever the appropriate structure is for each board?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the substance of this, and clearly something that's been close to the hearts of both our respective departments in terms of the performance and public confidence in this aspect of the meat industry. And I suppose what we have learned from this is that perhaps it had been an area of meat that we'd not quite shone the spotlight on that we might have done. And a series of incidents has helped us understand that and get to grips with it more fully. Comments from around the table about the approach that's been taken and the recommendations. Rosie.
Thank you very much. Well, I might as well kick off. I'm sure there'll be lots of comments. There are two particular areas that I was very interested in the recommendations, and one was around the workforce data. This is para 18 of the recommendations, and there's a lot through the final report and in the rest of the documentation. And this is about the verification of competence, how we're going to manage the register of training. And I just wanted to know a little bit more about what sort of timescale and where we're going to take that. That we're moving, therefore, into almost individual regulation versus a business regulation. We're going to be keeping a database of individuals, is my understanding from this. Maybe I've got that wrong. So I just wondered, are we looking at other bodies where professionals are regulated and registers are kept and competencies are checked on a regular basis? So that was my first question. And the second one, which is coming from a completely consumer angle throughout this, is about the tangible improvements that consumers want to see on visible evidence that the safety is paramount. And I just wanted to understand what the feelings are about processing history being available to consumers, even if it's not on labels and packaging, but if it's on QR codes, or if there's going to be any move in that direction at any point.
Thank you. I get Paul's questions as well, comments as well, and then we'll try and pick them up together if that's okay.
Okay. I thought it was an excellent report, and fully support the recommendations. A couple of questions about, I guess, which takes us into the implementation. So our consultation with industry has largely been through various industry organisations. And I guess that's going to roll through to actually putting the industry side of the recommendations in place as well. What is the actual membership of those? So is there a reasonable sized proportion of the industry that actually isn't part of those industry groups? And how are we addressing that, and how are we picking up and ensuring that they're actually brought into any of the recommendations going forwards? And the second point, just following up on Rosie's point, I think the people competency model, again, excellent, fully support that. Do we have concerns, though, that in raising the level of expertise required, in raising, if you like, the grade of the people involved, we're actually going to have problems in recruiting people in at the salary levels, the conditions that can actually be offered?
I'll take the first one, Chair. Thank you, Rosie, for the question. If I was capturing your point correctly in terms of the centralised database side of things, we are looking at a comprehensive system that will capture qualifications and experience and records of enforcement officers. In Scotland, we've started work on this already through our Scottish National Database System, which actually is also a record of all the food businesses that local authorities hold as well. So we're actually actively and directly interfacing with that data now. The database about what our staff hold in terms of qualification and experience is something that we are keen to work on and will develop going forward. I wasn't quite sure what you were referencing, though, another database.
I was just suggesting that if we're looking at individuals, and it will be the individual whose data we're going to be checking out, as opposed to the business, that obviously there are lots of professional bodies and regulators in other sectors who run these type of things, and are we using their expertise, or are we coming up with our own idea?
Absolutely, and one of the areas that we are actually piloting is the Institute of Food Science and Technology system, whereby they have an accreditation and CPD system for all working in the food industry, whether you're actually an operative on the shop floor, a manager within a food business operator, or a regulator. You can actually take part in that accreditation process, and we're looking to roll that out as a pilot to our meat hygiene inspectors and our veterinary personnel in Food Standards Scotland. More as a bolt-on to existing qualifications and validation that they have experience in the relevant areas of food law enforcement. So it's quite an exciting development. You also asked about processing data availability. That's a very good question, and we've deliberately put in a key recommendation about sharing industry data. This is obviously highly sensitive, and it's an area that we believe in the project team is necessary to secure the consumer confidence that is required, but also the regulator assurance around the performance of the industry. We need to work with the industry to make this happen. There are elements of food law that allow us to gain access to certain information at certain times, whether it be during an incident or an investigation. But we are talking here about a step above, and it's almost a step above of what regulation almost requires, and it's touching on the attitudes and behaviours point that I made. You know, we really want the industry to step up to the plate here, and openly share information with us. So your point about QR codes and that level of detail, that's something that we will work through in the implementation phase and in discussions with industry. But we expect industry to come forward with ideas as to how they can actually open up and present us with a much more transparent system than we do currently.
You also touched on the topic, Paul, around membership, and I think we felt that we had good coverage in terms of engagement, but obviously there are always going to be some companies that aren't members of their associations. We will, of course, have a relationship. Our two central competent authorities, FSS and FSA, will have a relationship through visiting, whether it be audits or unannounced inspections. So that will be the opportunity to pick up those issues on an individual basis. And of course, we'll work closely with local authorities as well.
So just to add to that, you mentioned about the qualification component here. It is a significant change in terms of uplifting to level 4 of HACCP. Incidents have shown us that there is a competency gap there, and that our own benefit, certainly with training our own staff to that level, has shown that there is a great benefit to be had there. We will work with industry to encourage uptake of that. Again, this is going above specifically what regulation currently requires. And there will be discussions of proportionality that will need to be entered into there. But clearly, we've got to set an ambition here, and we really want to raise the bar. And we're hoping that industry will work with us in that respect.
Thank you. You've got Mary and Dave.
Thank you. I mean, I really welcome the sort of scope and coherence of your review. I think I had a concern, probably really following on from what Paul was asking and what you've just said, Ian, about ensuring that it's not a sort of, in the pursuit of coherence, it's not a one size fits all in terms particularly of smaller businesses, and perhaps particularly game handling establishments where already 80% falls into the unregulated sector. So it's sort of ensuring that in creating something that's brilliantly coherent and great, that we don't end up with something that actually excludes lots of people. And it occurred to me that in recommendations 5 on the information sharing, it's making sure that we extract the data from SALSA as well as from or other things, as well as BRC, same as recommendation 8. The one of F5, 7, 8, 11 and 15 all occurred to me to have things where we would certainly need to have make sure we've thought about small food businesses, and that we weren't driving some things into the unregulated sector by getting excessive coherence.
Why don't you come back on that?
If I can kick off initially and turn to Colin. One of the things we've had to recognise in our recommendations and constructing the recommendations, Mary, is that size of business does not necessarily equate to the size of the risk. That small businesses themselves, and incidents have actually shown that some small businesses can indeed present very significant public health risk when things go wrong. I agree that there is an issue of proportionality, and we have to make sure that we have the correct solution in place for small businesses. There's no point in having a system in place if the vast majority of businesses are going to ignore it. What this is about working with industry to change behaviours and change thinking. It's to uplift the bar and get people to realise that actually there is a current skills gap there that we've seen as a result of recent incidents. Now, there is no legal requirement as it stands at this moment in time for everybody to have level 4 HACCP. We are setting the bar deliberately high. We will work with industry, and we've committed to do so in the report, to see how that will land. But it is an absolute aspiration that anybody that is preparing food for human consumption should at least have as high a qualification as we possibly can achieve.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. I suppose the first point to make is it's really impressive what you can achieve in 6 months when regulators and industry work together in a very collaborative manner. So excellent work both from both organisations and from industry, and hopefully something we can remind ourselves when we're setting future project timescales as well, that it is amazing what you can achieve. So well done on that. Two questions and 1 point. Firstly, in terms of the recommendations, have we had a chance to test with our fellow stakeholders their views on it? So what the local authorities think, what some of the industry groups think, and indeed what they ever think in Northern Ireland about the process, about the recommendations we've come up with. A point on implementation links into those which have been made already. Given much of this is going to be guideline driven and therefore have a voluntary element to it, to try and make sure we couch it in a way that it's useful for industry. The larger companies, they get some kind of incentive from it, but we may also need to consider for some of those smaller businesses, as you just said, Ian, how we can maybe help them with CCTV and level 4 training, because they will be, in their minds, perhaps discretionary costs. I've been doing this for 30 years, I know what I'm doing kind of thing. So I think during the implementation phase, please think about that. And then the second question is, what's our definition of success? We know where we are now. We're going to audit this activity in the future and obviously keep the boards updated. But what is our target outcome and how will we know when we've got there?
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Simon to cover some of the issues around engagement because he's been closest to them. In terms of the definition of success, it's, I suppose, at a hard level, you could say the levels of compliance. We obviously measure those and we have figures for those. But the level of engagement and the level of openness are other measures, I would suggest.
And Chair, in relation to engagement and how likely are we, sort of what sort of response are we expecting from local authorities and from industry and others? Given the level of engagement we've had through the process from those bodies, both at working level and also at sort of national level, I think that and we've already started to see some quotes from local authorities welcoming the report and the recommendations. We've had some positive responses from BMPA and others as well about both the conduct and some of the recommendations. So I think it will be welcomed and received positively. I think now there's the hard work of actually working through what the recommendations mean in practice and the implementation of those, which is clearly where the next phase of work takes us.
I think that it's on the question of success, and I think there's a number of things you can do around process improvement, etc., and compliance metrics or whatever. I think the measure of success for me is what Jason and I saw out in New Zealand, where industry are actually holding the regulator to account to what the regulator is doing to tackle non-compliant businesses, and there is a distinct culture. Mainly because food and drink is so important to the New Zealand economy, might be one of those influencing factors. But it is quite clear there's a level of intolerance within industry of non-compliant businesses because of the impact it has on the reputation of the whole business sector. And I think success for me is when we've actually got industry saying to us what is happening with these non-compliant businesses, and we're not there yet. So I think that's, for me, is a major measure of success.
I think we expect to see some of those sort of measures towards that goal in the implementation plan. But just to echo that, I was with a meat business last week who made exactly that point to me. Their expectations of us as a regulator to be able to find, identify and tackle those who are non-compliant. But we're all in this together to be able to make that work. George.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, to echo colleagues in thanking the teams involved for a very thorough and a very positive piece of work. So thank you for that. In a sense, to pick up on the point that's just been made, I think the challenge working so closely with industry is to ensure that we don't get sucked into any dilution of the fact that the responsibility lies with the food business operator. And our role as a regulator is to hold them to account, not to help them. It's to help them, but it's not to absolve them from that responsibility. And the second similar point, and I was delighted that you mentioned, I think, Ian, about learning from other regulators, because the work that we need to do in simplifying guidance and working with trade associations and ensuring that it makes sense, but it's not gold-plated, is something that other regulators are struggling with. So we should be working with the UK regulatory community just as much as we are with the industry to get that balance right. But my question to you is, in a sense, we got into this through the labelling and durability issues which are picked up in your last recommendation, recommendation 18. And that's the one where we say it'll be at least 18 months on. So should we not be slightly more ambitious in timescale on the durability, the standardisation of durability labelling? Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, George. In relation to the last point, recommendation 18, the reason why it's a post 18-month one was that the recommendation in full talks about the potential to have to change legislation, and there are other things we can do short of that, which we can start sooner, and there are other recommendations that talk about changing procedures in relation to labelling. So I think essentially the reason why it was such a long lead was in the event that we needed to take change regulations or legislation. But you're absolutely right. We can start that work as a priority, and I think we talk in one of the earlier recommendations about improving guidance and procedures in relation to labelling authenticity, which is in one of the earlier recommendations in the first 6 month tranche, I think, from memory.
Are you happy with that, George?
Yeah, It's in the recommendation 6 to 18 months, not under 6 months. I just think it's important that we give the public, who after all are our principal stakeholders, an guarantee and assurance that we are moving on labelling, not just leaving it in the longer grass and the durability issue. So,
I've got Laura, Colm and Ruth.
Thank you, and thank you very much for Food Standards Scotland for hosting us. But also to reiterate what other colleagues have said, this is an incredibly professional, very timely and very comprehensive report, and I endorse all your recommendations. Just one thing, I just wanted to make a comment on your implementation planning, and that is we talk about people and we talk about improving the expertise of sort of one named person within the organisation. The experience from what I recall of Two Sisters, but also Russell Hume, was that we ended up with staff beyond those people who were sort of responsible for the business who actually came forward. And I wondered to what extent we wanted to put in place some communications for all employees to take responsibility and to have an open door policy that they understand that we are here to listen to them and that they are in some ways one of our sort of first early warning signals that a business might not be being run according to our ambitions.
Yeah, the experience of Two Sisters and Russell Hume points to the fact that whilst we have recommendations here around systems and processes, what we're actually wanting to tackle underneath that is the culture, the underlying culture in organisations that haven't been compliant and don't have a good history of compliance. And that's really our proxy, using these as measures and trying to increase openness and engagement. And that has, the pilot with Two Sisters has been very successful to date. We obviously want to roll it out. And it's in that area that we think that that will give the greater assurance by tackling the underlying culture. And we recognise that whilst we have said we need staff trained to level 2 and one staff trained to level 4, that it's actually the underlying culture and the approach and the mindset of the company that we're trying to tackle.
Colm.
Chair, thank you. And if I can just echo the comments made around the room about the quality of the report and the timeliness of the report, so congratulations, and I think the fact that it was a collaboration across the 4 countries and with industry, it makes it a really powerful report. I have 2 questions, and if we go back, Colin, to the very early days of the review, whenever this started to unearth and so forth, there was clearly, and it's probably related a little to Laura's point, clearly there were pressures there within the businesses which caused some of this activity. To what extent have we been able to draw out early warning signs from the collaboration with industry so that we can actually, if there are going to be potential problems in the future, we get an early warning and that might happen? So that's my first question. Second question, which is quite on a different area, and it's consistency of inspection regime. So given that inspections are carried out by ourselves, by DERA in Northern Ireland, by the local authority community, are we doing enough within the recommendations to get a consistent approach to that? And how sure are we that the inspection regime is best in class? Because if I talk to meet industry, generally speaking, they will say that the regulator is slightly lighter touch than, say, a big supermarket, for example, in terms of audit and inspection. How do we improve that perception of our inspection regime as regulator and get a consistency across all of those involved in inspection?
Okay, thank you, Colm. Pressures and the insight into industry, you'll all be aware that the Russell Hume incident in particular is a live case at the moment, and it is fair to say that there are a number of issues emerging from that investigation that are helping shape some of the recommendations in this report. In terms of specifics here, I think it's something that we are working on. in terms of specific attitudes and behaviours within industry, there are a number of themes emerging from that investigation that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to go into at this moment in time. But it's clear that there are business behaviours that merit attention from techniques such as mass balance, forensic accountancy, and all that through investigation that will reveal certain practices that may drive certain fraudulent behaviour or certain poor practice in industry. These will emerge in time as the investigation progresses and closes. So I'd rather not go into too much detail about that at this moment in time. But your point is well made about that there are indeed pressures within industry practice as it currently stands that may incentivise some businesses, not them all, some, a very small few, into carrying out.
I suppose my point is, can the review ensure that we get that early warning system built into our processes? And
that's the intent behind the openness, the data transparency. We are wanting to build a culture just now whereby we have open dialogue with industry. The Two Sisters pilot has been quite an eye-opener, to have one food business that is actually giving us hardware, IT systems that are from their own internal systems to allow us to access whenever we want, without it's completely unfettered access, is actually the way to go. It's an exemplar, and it's something we will be encouraging other industry members to be as open as that. But you can appreciate that there's quite a lot of dialogue that will need to take place to get us there. I don't know if you want to add
But I think if I could just come in there as well, I think it's really important in doing that to come back to that point that we are not letting these businesses transfer their risk or responsibility onto us.
No.
So we're not starting a game of hide and seek in this. This is a really constructive step, but the responsibility for doing the right thing and having the right evidence about it remains on the food business.
I mean, the interesting point that Jeff raised, the New Zealand model, which we've had a close look at, there is almost an element of self-policing with the industry, and the industry have raised the level of overall compliance and performance by actually introducing, it's almost like a whistleblowing scheme, that they understand the risks to the wider industry, the reputational risk as well to the wider industry when you have a particular player or actor in that business that's not doing as they ought to be. So they engage with the regulators at an early point, and that's where we would like to get to. There is open dialogue with the industry that highlights where poor practice is emerging.
Can I add, sorry, Ross?
Sorry, I don't want to disturb the flow of the discussion, and I wholly agree with the point you've just made, Heather, that we're not shifting the balance of responsibility. I happen to think that this area that we've exposed, and that is the attitudes and the philosophy and the thinking within the food business operators, which then impacts back onto our thinking, is a matter that, with all due respect, I think both boards, to a greater and lesser extent, may look at one of the lessons to be looked at going forward. Because I do think that there are movements in the way in which regulation is conducted that would call for that. In Scotland, it's a ghastly title, Chair, with which you'll be familiar, but Professor Hodges' ethical business regulation is something which the Scottish Government, it doesn't like the title, and I can understand that, but they are quite taken with the processes that place more emphasis on food business operators in that openness, transparency and trust aspects which we're seeking. And I just happen, I'm also on the economic regulator for the water industry in Scotland, and we have been asked by the Scottish Government to embrace some of those principles in our price setting review. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it's very germane to what we have been discussing here. And I think as boards taking lessons forward, and I'm going to say no more, it's an area we need to look at which would assist our colleagues in the ground, and I think assist the industry in taking a different attitude to how you change attitudes and are more receptive and get to the point where actually you do pick up early warning signs because of that genuine openness and transparency. I'll say no more.
I think we're in the same boat. We've talked a lot around the FSA board table about the nature of a responsible food business. What's the behaviour you'd expect of a responsible food business? There's the letter of the law, and there's the spirit of how we're trying to serve consumers' needs. Did you want to comment
Chair,
on?
can I come back on Colm's point about consistency of approach in terms of inspections? And that comes back to the competency, the people competency in terms of our respective staff. And something that FSS have already done, but FSA needs to look at is also the integration between our audits and our unannounced inspections to make sure that we're using and deploying our resources most effectively on a risk basis, and also the balance between audits and unannounced inspections.
Can I just also add to that, Chair, that, and it's important for local authority colleagues that may tune into this debate, is that at this moment in time, the landscape for the meat industry official controls delivery side of thing is quite complex, and that one business can have an audit taking place by ourselves, whilst a trade and standards officer is in doing a metrology visit at the same time as an environmental health officer is undertaking food standards and hygiene visits on other parts of the business. One of the recommendations is obviously to look at that. And I think that if we get to the point of where the recommendation is actually leading us to is that for a business you have a regulator for food law, then that will clearly help to drive the consistency point.
Ruth.
Just going to pick up on that point, but just to echo the comments about the comprehensive and considered report that we have to look at today. Thank you very much for that. I also wanted to emphasise Colin's point about culture. And really, it won't happen unless it's consciously woven into all elements of the implementation plan. So, to make sure it's properly considered rather than looking through the recommendations and individually dealing with each one, there's something much more comprehensive about that culture shift that will need attention. But the question I was going to ask was around the recommendation where there's talk of evaluating a single entity to look at being the single organisation, looking at regulation. And it talks about working with a representative group of organisations. So have you thoughts about two things? First of all, will that be UK-wide? Will that representative sample be from all nations? And the second one was, what sort of things are you going to try and look at to tease out the benefits of what you've just described?
The intent will be for this to be UK-wide. It makes sense to continue with the pilot that is already started with ourselves and FSS, where we are reviewing Annex 5, the Code of Practice, and instead of having food hygiene inspections and food standards inspections, we will have a food law intervention, and that is looking at the both hygiene and standards. So labelling will be considered as part of the hygiene inspection. That presents a number of challenges for us. It's been clear from the evidence that we have received through LEAMS, through our national database returns, that the numbers of food standards interventions is reducing, and indeed as local authorities are struggling to retain staff, that we are finding that the number of people that are engaging in this work and have the competency to engage in standards work in particular is reducing. Couple that with the fact that we have for our, and certainly in Scotland, the meat official controls, our veterinary personnel, the vast majority do not hold English as a first language. And when you get into the territory of food standards official control, it is inordinately complex, and that it's going to require significant investment in our staff and our vets to get them to the place where we're confident that official controls and food standards can be delivered competently. So we're looking at what that landscape may look like. We are discussing and intend to go forward discussing with local authorities how that will land. We need to understand what the impact of that will be in terms of the numbers of interventions overall. And given the size and scale of operations in Scotland, we're roughly about 10% of the number of interventions that you would find in England and Wales, that it would make sense to see how that lands, and I will be working closely with colleagues in FSA to take that forward. So if that answers.
I was just going to say, in terms of the spread of the pilot, it'll depend on volunteer local authorities and what we haven't really opened this box fully. We know that there's an issue here in terms of the landscape. It's very confusing. We want to try and simplify it. But in the time for the review, we have a recommendation that we need to do more work in that space. But as I say, we need to open the box and see what it really involves.
Heather.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to say I really welcome the level of industry and engagement that's been done in this report. But looking to the recommendations, 6 of our 19 reports are solely at the for action by the industry, and you've already mentioned that some of this is above the legal requirements. So I was just seeking some degree of insight as to how much approval and agreement that the industry, which is not a single body, is actually going to take forward these actions.
Thanks, Heather. That's a good point because I think the danger with these sorts of reviews is that you tend to focus on the negatives and forget about the positives. And there's already, we know that there's lots of compliant businesses in the meat industry. They're not all bad. There's a high level of compliance in the meat industry, and a lot of businesses in the meat industry already go above and beyond the regulatory requirement. Now, you do have a debate about is it gold plating or not, but the reality is a lot of businesses are gold plating. So I think part of the issue is actually identification, like Two Sisters, but there are other examples around what industry already does above and beyond. And if they're doing it above and beyond, then you can challenge the rest of the industry. Well, it can be done. Here's the examples of how it can be done. And the challenge is for them to justify not doing it. So I think the issue is actually about making sure we focus on what's good about the industry and what it does well, and bringing that to the table as much as it is about saying, actually, there's a lot of issues here that need to be tackled. They absolutely do, but one of the best ways of tackling them is actually by identifying the good practice that's already there.
Isn't it also the case, though, those businesses that are doing that are doing it for good business reasons? So how do we help them capture and share with the rest of their colleagues in the industry what those good business reasons and benefits are? They're not only doing it to keep us happy. Their motivation is they see a consumer and business benefit from going above and beyond. Anybody else? Yes, Sue.
Can I just tease out a little bit more about the local authority approach to this? Because, as you say, in terms of taking things forward, the pilot will be very important and whatever. In terms of the stakeholder response we got from local authorities, recognising the challenges you've already talked about in terms of staffing and resourcing, particularly I know in the Scottish context for local authorities, what's their view at this stage? Are they supportive? Do you feel we will get sufficient pilots, or is it just a very mixed bag and we're going to have to work very hard on it?
Well, I can take some of it now. So, I mean, I think the short answer is it's a mixed bag, to be honest. There are some local authority colleagues out there that will fully embrace this, and there'll be some that will be a bit more resistant. I think it's just simply too early to report out a lot of detail in that one. It is early days.
I was just going to add, from informal engagement, I think Ian's right, it is a mixed bag, it'll take some hard work, but I think there has been enough interest already over the last 2 or 3 weeks for us to indicate that if we were to run a series of trials, that we'd have enough volunteers, given obviously being able to collaborate more effectively. So I'm confident that we can get, but that doesn't mean that it's all in the bag yet. There's still quite a bit of hard work to do.
In addition to that, the one element that has not been included in this report, obviously because the scope had to be curtailed, was the impact of EU exit as well. And clearly, a lot of the activity of local authorities in these types of establishments is around export. And clearly, we're trying to understand what the impact of EU exit will be on export certification requirements. So there are other drivers that are also going to be shaping what the future delivery landscape with local authorities will look like.
Any questions or input from anybody else around the table? No? Anything that our SRIs or Simon wish to add? We've covered all the ground, I think. Okay, well, I'm going to try and sum this up for the FSA. To say, let's go back to remember, we commissioned this review because we'd had a series of meat-related incidents across the UK. But we also did it knowing that we do in the UK have meat that's regarded as some of the safest in the world. And to echo Jeff's point earlier about the number of compliant businesses in the meat sector, and we wouldn't want them to think that we don't recognise the way that they shoulder and discharge their responsibilities for food to be safe and to be authentic. we've all welcomed the review, and I think we've all welcomed the participation of the industry and local authorities and other stakeholders. It has covered a lot of ground, and I would want to put on record our particular thanks to the Challenge Group under Alexis Cleveland's chairmanship, which I think has really helped focus as well as challenge, so that we get to a point of some strong, evidenced and impactful conclusions and recommendations. I think for the FSA, we'd welcome the commitment from industry bodies to work collaboratively with the regulator. That has to be the right way forward. And we hope that translates into making tangible improvements which are going to be visible to consumers, who are the people who matter in all of this, and that they can have their assurance, further assurance that food businesses in the meat sector are prioritising food safety within their management culture. I think the FSA board is agreeing that we confirm the recommendations in Annex 1 and the different buckets of responsibility into which they fall, and we do call on industry to work collaboratively and constructively with us and with local authorities to take these forward. We will, of course, be sensitive to any specific circumstances, proportionality, any needs or assistance that we can give, but we are looking for a change of culture overall, and we are not looking to shift the responsibility or the risk that sits in food businesses for food safety and authenticity onto the regulator. The measures that we've identified here, we think will help all of us achieve a better outcome for consumers, and I think we're happy to endorse them on that basis. The implementation plan will come back to the business committee, where we'll see it, I think, in twin tracks, part of our regulatory reform programme, with Maria in the lead there, and part of Colin's operational responsibility. We'll commission a post-implementation review, and the implementation plan will contain measures so that we know the success that we're aiming to achieve and how we will be able to track against those measures. Happy with that? Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Ross to do the same thing for his board.
Thank you very much, Heather. I mean, I think the first thing I want to say is I think that the general public looking at a summary of these recommendations might be slightly misled into thinking that none of them just comes off the page and hits you. And we're to be cautious in terms of us as Food Standards Scotland selling this, because I think we've got to be clear that the large volume and body of work that has gone into this has revealed quite a number of important areas which cumulatively and collectively could and can, and I hope will, make a big difference into the way in which we operate and control the management of the meat industry. And I think the cumulative effect of this can be quite substantial, and it won't happen overnight. So I think that we have a duty as board members to be clear to anyone who happens to ask us, and they do, well, they don't seem terribly exciting, these. Yes, well, they are very important and they will make a difference. And don't be surprised that there's not an immediate big bang, because actually, as has been said frequently throughout this meeting, the vast majority of the industry are compliant. But it was the hugely increasing number of disappointing incidents across the industry that we, as the collective bodies, took action early. I mean, someone asked me the other day, gosh, are we now in a dreadful state? And I said, no, we're not. But what the respective Food Standards Agency and Food Standards Scotland have decided is that before that decline becomes serious, we will intervene now by calling for this investigation and for this work to be done. So it's not a question of there being a big, but those incidents that took place posed a very serious threat to the public, and it's the public interest that we serve. So from our point of view, in summing this up, I think the board are clear in Scotland that we endorse. Well, first of all, we're very grateful to the joint and collective work right across the piece, both from our own officials, your officials, out into the industry, out into the public and other bodies and stakeholders who participated. I think we are fully endorsing the recommendations. I think the one point that was made by George, and the one we would like to see just be cautious and careful about, is that since we went into this and the issue that was emerged was durability, that notwithstanding the reasons why it has been given a longer time scale, that it can't lose its sense of importance. And that in agreeing those recommendations, we will also take this back into our own, because we will treat it as a board rather than in a specific subcommittee, and that we will also take forward clearly the importance of, for this to be successful, the need for us not only to work on what is specified in the measures about attitudes and industry and working with industry to assist them, but also giving thought to taking that forward. So I think there is a great deal of combined agreement, which is not entirely surprising. We will go about the implementations in our respective and slightly different ways, but I think it's clear that the message from this meeting, Chair, is that there is absolute unanimity, both about the degree of importance we attach to this report and our determination to work with the industry to ensure that it is successful.
Thank you very much. Ross, I think that now closes our formal joint meeting of the Food Standards Agency and Food Standards Scotland boards. So thank you very much to the people who've attended. We hope you found it a useful and constructive event. Thank you.